We are excited to provide this virtual series during the month of September, which is National Recovery Month. Today's session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the CMH YouTube channel for future reference. Please feel free to use the chat box to ask questions and add comments you have at any time during this webinar. And if time allows, we'll do our best at the end to answer as many questions as we can. Our presenter today is Dr. Annette Mercantant. Dr. Mercantant is the Medical Health Officer of the St. Clair County Health Department. A Detroit native, she is an alumni of Michigan State University and Wayne State University School of Medicine. She completed her family practice residency at St. John's Hospital, Detroit, and worked as a private physician from 1990 to 2008. She received her master's in public health from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in 2011. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Mercantant.
Welcome, everybody. I'm going to present this relationship between trauma, particularly adverse childhood experiences, and substance use disorders. First slide, please. First slide, please.
Just a sec, we're trying to get it to advance. It's
there we go. Yeah, and I apologize. I'm going to have you guys do that because I don't have the access on my computer. So memory is of our experiences stored in our body. And from the first spark of life, as cells divide and form that first tiny beating heart, fragile skeletal structure, and a central nervous system, the experience of being in a relationship with another person and with the world around us has a profound impact on who we are and who we will become. Although we can recall and describe with words much of what's happened in our lives, the reality is the memory of human experience is stored in our bodies in a very physical way and not just in our minds. Next slide. I'm going to share with you the findings from the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. We call it the ACE study. The ACE study confirms with considerable scientific evidence that adversity early in life increases physical, mental, and behavioral problems later in life. The ACE study is the largest study of its kind with over 17,000 participants, and it was developed and co-sponsored by Kaiser Permanente of San Diego and the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia. And it was first developed in the early 1990s. The two principal investigators are pictured here, Dr. Robert Anda and Dr. Vincent Folletti. I had the pleasure of studying under Robert Anda to become an ACE trainer, which is where this information comes from. Next slide. Before I one before that. Skipped over one. Thank you. Before I introduce the ACE study, I need to explain a little bit about brain development. The human central nervous system really connects us to ourselves, to other people, and to the world around us. Its primary function is really to keep us alive. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and that integrates all of our senses and the information from receptors that are located throughout our body to itself. So it regulates internal body functions and manages very elaborate electrical and chemical signals. The central nervous system considers sensory inputs in the context of each and every second, almost instantaneously. And it determines our understanding of and our response to the world that we live in and to these sensory inputs. Cells in the central nervous system are called neurons, and they are stunningly effective in processing and transmitting information as they have the central purpose in doing this, to adapt in ways that keep us alive. Next slide. So on the far left, we see a set of brain cells or neurons and what they might look like at the time of birth. There aren't many connections then between cells at birth. Babies are born with only the connections and brain functions they need at that point in their life. So most of the wiring of our brains occurs as a result of life experiences and from our senses. By age 6, those same brain cells now have many connections. And the wirings of the brain or the makings of complex neural networks is experience dependent, as you would see in that middle panel. What gets experienced the most tends to lead to the most robust connections between the nerve cells, and they form these elaborate networks. And this process of branching is called arborization. The last panel, the section of the slide, represents neurons at the age of 14, about the time of puberty. And you'll note that there are now fewer connections between the brain cells and then there were at the age of 6 or elementary age. And this is because the least experienced connections tend to withdraw about the time of puberty. This process is called pruning. And this phenomenon helps to explain why neglect or not using these central nervous system connections can have a powerful negative impact on health and social functioning. So basically what gets used a lot and patterns that get utilized develop stronger and more robust connections, and those that don't get utilized can literally just disappear. Next slide. So every person's life is unique. We know that. But for illustration, next slide, please. For illustration, let's imagine two simplistic worlds. One is mean and dangerous, and the second is kind and generous. The top being the dangerous world and the bottom, the generous world. So traumatic experiences during development, like abuse or neglect, generate predictable patterns of brain architecture. They create predictable patterns of behavior and traits. Humans are really only made to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time, long enough to prepare for fight or flight or to hide. So experiences that cause stress chemicals to be continuously produced, for instance, in certain types of child abuse, neglect, or being in a war zone, for instance, these have a big impact on development. Because under these circumstances, our bodies tend to prepare for ongoing life in a dangerous world. So these stress hormones exert influence on cells, on chemicals, and specifically on the wiring of our brains. They sculpt the brains that are wired for certain characteristics, like being edgy or hot-tempered or impulsive, dissociated, numb. This is the path outlined on the top line of this slide. For example, people who have had traumatic stress from conception to the toddler years will likely have higher baselines of stress hormones that can actually be detected, like cortisol. As a result, these folks may have a very short fuse. They might be self-focused, have difficult time shifting from emotions to problem solving. If there is more danger just around the corner, being focused on other people may not be the most optimal way to survive. So this is actually an adaptive mechanism for survival in a dangerous world. But the downside is that stress hormones like cortisol, when they hang around for a long time, they actually end up being toxic to brain cells. This toxicity makes it difficult for brain cells to develop healthy neural networks and can even cause brain cells to die, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. And this is why we call continuous stress and episodic unpredictable stress, we call that toxic stress. Next slide. So this slide just kind of is, the next slide, is to illustrate the fact that adaptive neural mechanisms are not good or bad. So one common belief in our society is that people who experience, for instance, the situation on the top group of the previous slide, those are maladaptive or bad, and that people along the bottom are better. But this is not true. Both pathways are adaptive, and both brains are adapting to the experience, the reality that people live in. And that's good for us as a species. The people whose brains adapt to a dangerous, stressful world are more likely to survive in that world. And people whose brains are wired for a safe world are likely to be more prepared to meet society's expectations in more tranquil times. So our experiences actually get wired into our biology. And this slide just goes to show that certain characteristics can actually be of benefit in certain types of situations. Next slide. So it's only when our biology collides with social expectations that we really run into trouble. For instance, if you put a person from the benevolent world into a chaotic and turbulent environment, say, of a riot control situation, that person may struggle until they've learned some very specific skills. And likewise, a child adapted to a very dangerous or stressful world may not sustain patience. He or she may not share, cooperate, or use words as their first choice. So when that child comes to school and we ask him or her to sit still and share and cooperate, there can be a painful disconnect there that's hard on everyone. The child will have to be actively taught the skills required to succeed in this context, just as we would have to train a person from the benevolent pathway to act in a chaotic and dangerous environment. So you really need to stop thinking about these pathways as good or bad, but just as adaptive to the situation that they have been raised in. Next slide. So when human biology and the human brain are evaluated and studied through a very systematic process, particularly isolating one factor at a time, what was found is that the brains of people who have experienced neglect or abuse compared to the brains of people who have not have very specific changes. And the findings suggest that maltreatment does affect brain development in very predictable ways. And interestingly enough, not all experiences generate the same effects. There have been kind of developed 3 known variables that have very clear determinations in brain development. The type of maltreatment, the gender or the sex of the individual, and the age at the time of maltreatment. And these 3 variables can cause very distinct and different outcomes. And we'll go through some of them in the next few slides. So let's take a closer look at one of the factors that determines the effect of maltreatment, which is age. So why would the age of a person at the time of maltreatment have such a powerful impact? And that's because the brain develops in a sequential form from, as we talked about, most rudimentary at birth to most more complex. And it's a sequence from primitive to more advanced. So think about it. Why is this so? A tiny baby doesn't need to be able to write a paper or pass a math exam, but she does need to breathe, to eat, to regulate body temperature, to sleep, and to connect with people who will nurture and protect her. So the parts of the brain that control body temperature and functioning and the ability to connect to primary caregivers, those parts of the brain develop first. Brain regions that control complex thoughts and processes like abstract writing and math, these are not fully developed until much later in childhood. And so continues this complex dance of experience and adaptation that generates the brain and appropriate capacities for feeling and thinking in a very sequential way, like a scaffolding. As the brain develops, there are sensitive periods for each brain region when the size and the functional abilities of that region are most experienced by the experiences and are most vulnerable to these toxic stresses. So new abilities on the growth and development from earlier months and years can have different effects. And over time, elaborate systems of specialized brain regions develop that help us to navigate more and more complex environments. And so as we go through this, this is why age has such a profound impact on these maladaptive centers. So the first area of the brain that has been studied that clearly has an impact like this, next slide, is the limbic system. And this is one of the most elaborate systems in our brain. It's the limbic system, and the brain regions in the limbic system control many things that we consider like the fight or flight response. It also includes physical balance, internal temperature regulation, and even our digestion. The functions we will focus on are the system's ability to regulate hormones and mood and heartbeat and sexual behavior. So the limbic system is vital for learning as well, memory, and reward reinforcement processes that help us stay on a healthy track. So this limbic system is vitally important for our well-being throughout our life course, and is primarily known for this fight, flight, or freeze response that we do in response to danger. Next slide. So the two main structures that we're going to talk about in the limbic system are the hippocampus and the amygdala. And these are two regions in the system that are vital for forming healthy relationships. They are the centers for affect or mood and attention. They help us make meaning from social cues and language, and help us to remember verbal and spatial information. So these regions regulate panic and fear and a whole range of emotional responses. And they help us put the brakes on emotional outbursts when we need to. Next slide. So the hippocampus and amygdala are particularly vulnerable to all forms of maltreatment in the first 3 years of life, and to sexual abuse through the age of 5. The effects of maltreatment, despite we know that the impacts are in those early years, the effects of this maltreatment may not be clinically available or visible until you reach the ages of 9 to 13. So why is that? At birth, the hippocampus has granulars, or they're called granule or seedling cells, that are biologically programmed to grow and mature only at the time of puberty or during adolescence. So delayed symptoms from toxic stress occurs because stress hormones like cortisol actually kill these seedling cells. So when the cells are killed, the effects are often not seen until much later in life, when they fail to grow and produce the brain mass needed for these specialized functions. Next slide. So another brain region that we're going to talk about is the cerebellar vermis, which connects the two halves of the cerebellum, which is way in the back of the brain. The vermis helps us to move through physical environments, enables us to preserve peripheral details in the world around us. So this is the part of our brain that pays attention, for instance, to what a group of strangers standing at the side of the road might do, even while we're continuing to walk towards our destination. So it's no surprise that one consequence of maltreatment in this area are attention problems, including attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The vermis is also the part of the brain that regulates the release of our feel-good brain chemistry, which is norepinephrine and dopamine. Research on abuse in this region shows not only reduced size of the vermis, but decreased blood flow and functionality as well. So with limited access to positive feelings, it isn't surprising that impacts to this region can lead to vulnerability to depression and substance abuse. By the way, rocking, when you have damage, particularly in this areas, that rocking sensation that we often see in some individuals, or rocking a baby side to side, stimulate positive effects in this region in particular. Next slide. So the vermis is sensitive to all forms of maltreatment, primarily just before puberty. And symptoms may not actually fully emerge in this area until adulthood. The vermis may be the seat of mental health. It has a role in virtually every mental illness, including schizophrenia, borderline personalities disorders, and depression. And we are only beginning to understand the biological connections between trauma-induced adaptations here in the vermis and mental illness and substance abuse as well. Next slide. The corpus callosum is another vital structure that's impacted throughout the span of childhood. And this one has a much broader range throughout childhood where it's impacted. The corpus callosum is a superhighway that connects the right and left hemisphere of the brain. Each hemisphere of the brain is specialized to control movements and feelings in the opposite side of the body. And each hemisphere specializes in processing certain types of information, such as language or spatial patterns. And I think we've all heard of right-sided brain and left-sided thinkers, because it's a different way of approaching the world. In order to coordinate movement or even think about complex information, the right and the left hemisphere must communicate with each other. So the corpus callosum helps us interpret and apply symbols to integrate language and mathematics. And it's the part of the brain we use when we're given story problems to solve. So it's got, this part of the brain has hundreds of millions of nerve fibers as a superhighway going back and forth. And they're all covered by something called the myelin sheath, which does affect the speed of this transmission. And these myelin sheaths are often also what's impacted by maltreatment. Let's go to the next slide, talk about that. So exposure to neglect in infancy, especially in boys, and exposure to sexual abuse around ages 9 or 10, especially for girls, have powerful impacts on the corpus callosum. So exposure impedes cell division, and it interrupts that myelin sheath that I described along the nerve fibers, which is that fatty layer of insulation that helps those nerves communicate. So maltreatment disrupts this electrical activity, making this cross-brain communication less reliable and less effective. So less cross-brain communication can lead to the inability to integrate rational ideas, particularly in a highly emotional state. So you may know someone who doesn't seem to be able to respond well when you ask him or her to calm down so you can talk through a problem. Now, this may not be a choice. This may be a biological adaptation, in fact, to a childhood experience. So next slide. The current toxic stress in early childhood then has a profound impact on brain structure and function that develops often later in childhood. And these functions include the mediation of emotional responses, social interaction, and especially abstract thinking. And that's why people say that early childhood is so important, and they're right. But early childhood isn't the only sensitive developmental period, according to this research. Brain research also has been introduced that simplifies and limited scope, but it's also early in its infancy. It's very accurate. For each brain region has sensitive periods when experiences that have powerful effects on that brain mass. For example, during middle childhood, around ages 7 to 13, emotional and verbal abuse can affect the centers for processing sound, developing verbal language, and perceiving social cues. Effects can be different for boys and for girls. And for example, both neglect and sexual abuse affect boys and girls, but neglect in infancy and through the toddler years for boys has a much larger effect on cross-brain communication, while the cross-brain communication is profoundly affected in girls when they experience sexual abuse around the ages of 7 to 10. So by the time we reach our late 20s, our central nervous system with the brain and its command centers and all of its orchestration and autonomic body function like breathing and heartbeat, all of this has been developed usually by our mid-20s. The elaborate the elaborate signaling system in our brains is all in place by then. So in a fraction of a second, these systems determine whether a sensory input, a sensory information that we're receiving from sight or sound, taste or smell, should be responded to and how it's responded to. That has all been developed and laid down. And this information is immediately filtered in a matter of seconds. So stress may be interpreted by the brain at this time as something we can tolerate and work through, or something that's overwhelming. And our set points for that interpretation are largely in place by early adulthood. Next slide, please. So we do have a choice, and I want to make sure that this all sounds terrible, and it is profoundly important information, but also the fact that we know that toxic stress has impacts on human development, but these childhood times are also windows of great opportunity for building resiliency. After all, developing the brain is sensitive to all kinds of experiences, both positive and negative. So by paying attention and understanding what these sensitive developmental periods are, we have a great opportunity to better protect our children and providing the kinds of challenges and supports they need to remediate periods of stress that, let's face it, they often have absolutely no control over. We have a choice collectively as a society to develop skills and accommodations that enable everyone to understand and contribute to more resilient and positive responses. So if you remember only one thing from the information about this brain development that I've given you, is that toxic stress can be hardwired into our biology. And oftentimes what this does is it shapes our response to individuals from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And I think that change in response and perception has a profound impact on how we react to each other and the kinds of support that we can do. Next slide. I'm going to just spend a very short period of time on epigenetics. This is a very complex and emerging field of science in the central nervous system. It's a field that explains how experiences kind of get into our DNA and create permanent changes in how cellular expression is made. So our genes are contained in the DNA of our cells. Genes provide the instructions for our cells to become specialized in the liver cells, heart cells, and so forth. And they are the keys to how our cells react to disease throughout our life course. So the epigenetics tells us about the ways that the instructions on our genes are used, so how genes are expressed. To understand epigenetics, it's important to understand a bit about how DNA is organized. For example, think of a long strand of fishing line, many yards of it. And in order to fish without the line being tangled or disorganized, a fisherman puts the line on a reel so the line can be let out or brought in and stay organized. So we have thousands of genes, and our long strands of DNA are tightly condensed into the chromosomes in the nucleus of our cells. And looking more closely like the fishing lines on the reels, DNA is tightly wrapped around protein balls called histones. These are represented by those orange or reddish cylinders on the middle picture. Epigenetics involves the attachment of chemicals to the histones, to the DNA at particular gene sites. The attachment of these chemicals prevents the gene message from being available to read, or it turns it on. Other types of chemical attachments open and shut the genes in very specific sequences. And so the instructions that are in the genes can be read by the cells and produced into very specific things. So here's the relevance to ACEs with all of this. New research suggests that stressful experiences can actually influence the chemical methylation or the chemical histones that turn gene structures on or off in ways that have both negative or positive effects on the ways our cells function. This is an important reason why ACEs are related to so many health and social problems, because they actually can directly influence our DNA expression. The hopeful part of this is that other positive life experiences can also have these effects, and this is why resiliency and the positive sides of ACEs can also be thought of in such a profound way. Next slide. So the new science of epigenetics tells us that the ability of our cells to read messages on our genes is influenced by our experiences. Science has discovered that responses to stress can also be passed on from one generation to the next. So this is a really interesting study. One study, scientists conditioned rats to be afraid of the smell of cherry blossom. So they did electric shock at the same time the wafting of the cherry blossom odor went in through the cages. So when the cherry blossom odor came into the rat's environment, they huddled together in this stunned, fearful position until the odor was removed. So these rats had pups who grew up without any exposure to cherry blossoms. And this generation of rats was also separated from their parents and placed into a different environment. And yet, when the smell of cherry blossoms was put into their environment, these offspring of these rats were also jumpy. They had a heightened sensitivity to the smell of cherry blossoms. And I think we can kind of correlate this to maybe, for instance, like fear of spiders or things that we have that we know just kind of come intuitively from deep within us. So why might this be a good thing for the sensitivity or fear to be passed from one generation to another through epigenetics? Why may it be a good thing for a rat to feel fear even though no one instructed them to feel fear? And of course, the answer to that is survival. These are fears that can be protect a species from dangerous situations, toxins, spiders, or snakes, for instance. And it may be adaptive for fear to be passed from one generation to the next if it can prevent poisonings or avoid danger. So this field may help us understand how groups of people can be deeply affected by historical trauma. Despite different efforts to care for one another as the trauma has receded. So how do we heal the wounds of some of our ancestors? And these are really profound thoughts and activities, and we won't really fully know the answers to that question, but we do know that we are the ones responsible today for this because we are the ones that have the understanding of this impact. So this is just something to keep in mind about epigenetics and how we can actually inherit behavior, both nurturing and otherwise, from one's parents and grandparents. Next slide. So we've been talking about the effects of toxic stress on individuals and brain architecture and structure, but now we're going to talk about something about toxic stress on the population as a whole. This is called the Field of Epidemiology, which is where scientists study the origins of disease, disability, productivity, et cetera, and health in a population as opposed to in an individual. Epidemiology helps us focus on efforts and the issues that will make a difference for the well-being of the whole, the entire community, as opposed to the individual. So we're going to talk about a large epidemiological study about the enduring effects of adverse childhood experiences. And we're going to go back to that study I mentioned at the beginning with Dr. Anda and Valetti as the original co-principal investigators. Next slide. The ACE study concept is that adverse childhood experiences disrupt neurodevelopment, which in turn leads to social, emotional, and cognitive adaptations that can lead to the risk factors that then lead to major causes of disease, disability, social problems, and early death. So since the time of the ACE study, lots of research in developmental neuroscience, which I've shared a little bit with you, and the epigenetics shows us that the hypothesis of ACE study is biologically sound. And that's why I went over with you all the brain architecture stuff first, because that shows that there's a biological basis, what was then found in the epidemiological studies. Neuroscience and epigenetic discoveries help us understand the progression of adversity from preconception all the way through life's course. And historical trauma and generational adversity has then added to this. So the study was designed to understand how adverse childhood experiences influence human development in predictable ways. And this is an important concept because finding the predictability of these outcomes, when something is predictable, it's preventable. And so the real powerful impact of this is if we understand how these things can happen in sequence in a predictable way, it's much easier to take that next step to prevent them in the first place. Next slide. So most prior studies of the health and social effects of childhood abuse focused on single types of adversity, for instance, studies about sexual abuse and outcomes. This study was different. It broadened the picture to include multiple types of childhood stressors. In addition, the ACEs study measured a wide array of health and social problems. And so this is how the study expanded the knowledge into a much more broad public health perspective. The ACE study is unique because it provides the potential to understand how multiple forms of childhood stressors can affect many, many important public health problems. So the design of the study began in 1991. And then in 1994, the CDC provided funding to conduct further studies in San Diego. The initial study included 17,000 adult members of the Kaiser Health Insurance Plan Company. And these individuals completed a survey about their childhood experiences, their health behaviors, disease risks, and mental health and substance abuse issues, as well as many other health and social problems. The individuals studied were from the age of 19 to 94 years old, so this did not include pediatrics. And the original study design were generally well educated. Most had attended college, and only 6% did not have a high school diploma. And this is important to recognize, given the results, that this is not a reflection of the broader US population. For instance, as many as 13% of the US population does not have a high school diploma. So these were predominantly white, middle-class people who had access to some of the best healthcare in the world. And the study participants are still being followed to this day to assess the relationship of ACEs as to their causes of death, the incidence of their diseases, healthcare utilization, and even the use of prescription medications. Next slide. This slide shows the outcomes of, we'll go through some of the original outcomes of the original study. This slide shows the 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences that were studied. And this often comes up like, well, what about a death in the family? Or what about this? And yes, those are all stressors, and yes, they all probably contribute. But as far as the ACEs study was concerned, these were the original 10 that were studied. The first group are indicators of household dysfunction, which includes growing up with substance abuse household members, either alcohol or drugs, parental separation or divorce, growing up with a mentally ill household member or caregivers, and importantly, witnessing intimate partner violence, particularly a battered mother. Criminal behavior was evidenced by having a household member who was incarcerated or imprisoned. So the 3 forms of childhood abuse studied were emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. And then there were 2 forms of neglect that were studied, both emotional and physical. And as you can see, for the percentage on the slide, ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, are common, even in this middle-class, well-educated population. So I'd like to take a moment here to talk about the fact talking about adverse childhood experiences can cause a lot of physical and emotional feelings in people, because many of us have experienced much of this. And maybe there's an opportunity to understand that you're not alone, and that these emotional responses to discussing these things are understandable. But please, if going through these slides is causing you any undue concern, please reach out and talk to a licensed healthcare provider, or at least somebody who has your best interests at heart, because discussing this sometimes does kind of stir up a lot of feelings. Next slide. So ACEs usually do not occur in isolation. So for example, the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse are highly related to being exposed to intimate partner violence. So the slide, the bars that you see there, the different color bars, are representing the frequency of witnessing violence against a mother. Okay, so you go from never witnessing of violence against a mother to very often in the very dark bars. So as you can see, the higher the frequency of witnessing domestic violence, also the higher the chance that you have experienced emotional, physical, or even sexual abuse. So this is a profound pattern that we see throughout the ACEs studies, that the same pattern is seen throughout the study, that where there is one form of a stressor, the risk of other stressors increases dramatically. So this is one of those things that if you look at siloed types of outreach or support systems, that can really help if individuals know about ACEs. For instance, if you work in a domestic violence support system or response team, knowing that those individuals have likely experienced other adverse childhood experiences as well, simply because they experienced that, I think can really improve your interaction and therapeutic responses. Next slide. So because the adverse childhood experiences are so highly interrelated, it didn't make sense to look at how a single category of ACEs influenced health or social problems. So instead, the doctors developed something called an ACE score. This score is simply a count of the number of categories of ACEs that each person reported, from 0 to 10. And each category counts as 1 point in the ACEs score. So if a person experienced physical abuse, no matter how many times or how severe, that poor person gets an ACEs score of 1 for that particular category. If the person experiences physical abuse or had a substance abuse parent, the ACE score is 2, or so on. So think of the ACE score as a measure of the childhood biological stress dose. Remember, we talked a little bit about toxic stress. The ACE score, as the ACE score goes up, on the average, the exposure to the development effects of the toxic stressors also increases. So in this illustration, you see that only 1/3 of the people in the study had an ACE score of 0. 16% had a score of 4 or more. Adverse childhood experiences are common. They do tend to occur in clusters, and they are an absolute hidden burden in our population. So if you look for it, you find it, and you can't assume that the person sitting next to you has led a harmless life. Next slide. So people who report higher ACEs scores, this is the bottom line, right, are more likely to have health and social problems. In fact, as ACEs scores go up, the percentage of people with health and social problems also goes up. And this is called a dose-response curve, a dose-response relationship. It's the dose-response scenario. So the more gas you put in your car, the farther you can go. But in this case, where there's a higher dose of adverse childhood experiences, the higher percent of people with health problems. Next slide. Let's look at a couple of these. So I'll show you today a few of them, but I can tell you that they just go on and on and on. For almost every health condition you can think of, there's relationships that we can find to ACEs. But so all these slides too, along the bottom, the horizontal axis are the ACEs scores. And so you go from an ACE score of a light blue bar, which is 0, up to the dark blue bar, which is 4 or more ACEs. And on the far left, you see on that axis, you'll see the percentage of people who have whatever disease or condition we're studying. So in this first set of bars on the far left, we see that the percent of people who became regular cigarette smokers by the age of 12 goes up at each level that the ACE score goes up. In the second set of bars, we see that the percent who are smokers as adults goes up in a stepwise fashion, again, in this dose-response fashion, as the scores go from 0 to 4 or more. And people with higher scores have increased risks of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. And what we know about COPD is that it's also directly related to smoking history. So ACEs lead to early onset of smoking, which is sustained throughout adulthood, and eventually leads to high risk of smoking-related lung disease. Now, it doesn't mean that every person who smokes has a high ACE score, or every person who doesn't smoke has no trauma. But these are relationships that have a really very strong correlations. Next slide. So ACEs can result in depression and anxiety, as we talked about, and nicotine can reduce symptoms of depression and anxiety. So think about this. The benefits of nicotine in reducing these unpleasant emotions might help to explain why health risks due to smoking are not enough for some people to quit. Smoking, in fact, may be a form of adaptive behavior. So, we think a lot about this. It is much more complex than if you have a problem, you could self-medicate. But these issues are very real because they are wired directly into our brain chemistry. Next slide, please. So what's the story of your life? This allows us, again, to think about the fact that people can, in fact, have situations unknown to you that are really impacting their responses that are biological. Not to say they can't be overcome. Learned behaviors and new pathways can be built in the brain, but oftentimes these responses are instantaneous. They're immediate, and they're not really provoked by thought. They're just like fight or flight responses. And so these are things to keep in mind, even in your own life, when you wonder why you behave a certain way or may have a certain response to situations. Next slide, please. So now we can begin to anticipate why ACEs are related to behaviors, social conditions, etc. Here we see a risk of developing alcoholism and how it increases sixfold from an ACE score of 0, the light blue bar, to an ACE score of 6 or 4 or more. And ACEs can affect relationships. So the second set of bars are the people with higher ACEs scores who are more likely to marry a person with alcoholism. And you think about this for a minute. Think how ACEs tend to be transmitted then from one generation to another. Next slide. And by the way, the magnitude sixfold is a very profound dose relationship that we often don't find in epidemiology and many other situations. So the risk of ACE scores in liver disease. So the ACE scores on the bottom, 0 to 4 or more, and on the left, percent of people who report liver disease. And you can see, again, it goes up with the ACE scores. And I bring up liver disease because this is a risk factor directly associated with drug use, needles and syringes that are contaminated, particularly with hepatitis virus. Of course, you can also get hepatitis in other ways, but it's notorious with that, and also having sex with a person who is infected with the virus. Alcohol is also strongly associated with liver disease. So again, these substance abuse issues and long-term health outcomes can be tied to adverse childhood experiences. Next slide. So we looked at how the chances of having risk factors and health and social problems increase as ACEs scores go up. But we've also looked at these problems one at a time. And so the ACE researchers that learned that adverse childhood experiences can affect multiple brain systems and functions called comorbidities. And they wondered if ACE scores would lead to the risk of having multiple health and social problems. And of course, it's no surprise, the answer to that is yes, they do. So on the right side of the slide, you'll see a list of 18 health and social problems that could be affected given the brain systems and functions we know to be impacted by toxic stress. And the researchers created a second score, which is the average number of health and social problems, the health records of the studies of these participants. And then what we see in this slide is the number of the 18 listed health and social problems increases as the ACE scores go up. So from an ACE score of 0, people averaged about 1 or 1.5 of those 18 health problems. But as the score goes up to 7 to, for instance, to 7 or 8, they averaged 4.5 of them, and it just continues from there. So this told the ACE study team that higher ACE scores meant the chances of having multiple health problems and social problems are also increased. So this shows you that the cost and complexity of problems is also affected by childhood experiences. Next slide. This is a list of just some of the health and social problems documented by the ACE study publications, and this has been added to considerably even since then. Because ACEs have powerful impacts on many health and social problems, ACE researchers concluded that ACEs are the leading cause of health and social problems in our country. And this should lead us to thinking about prevention. As I mentioned before, what's predictable should be preventable. So we're living in this time where we have this information, and it's really a profound point for shifting our thoughts and our trajectory about health and well-being to our future generations and how we approach them. Next slide. So ACEs are common, they are interrelated, and they are extremely powerful. They have a cumulative impact that is captured by the ACEs score. And people with higher ACEs scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, but they're not destined to have more social and mental problems. We want to talk about that a little bit more in the next slides. But some of which these problems can increase the odds of their children having high ACEs scores. So this discovery about the effects of toxic stress and the developing brain and the biological plausibility are all information that make a strong case for concluding that the relationship between ACEs scores and health problems is truly a cause and effect relationship. And this is something that is very important in medicine. When you know one thing causes another, you know that you can focus on the interventions there to have an impact. Next slide. So how do we put this all together and make a case for understanding this as a pathway to health and well-being? And we understand that are common and have strong cumulative impacts on the risk for common health and social problems. Preventing ACEs and their intergenerational transmission is the greatest opportunity for improving well-being, perhaps the most important thing. This slide shows the percentage of various health and social problems that epidemiologists estimate are caused by ACEs, population attributed risk. And you'll notice that any one of these conditions is not 100% caused by ACEs, nor are there situations where there's ACE involvement at all. But the percentage of problems coded in that black area is called the oil spill. It represents the percentage of each problem that's potentially preventable by preventing an ACE. So the idea is, for instance, for marijuana use, if 54% roughly of marijuana use is attributable to ACE scores, if you reduce ACE scores, you could potentially eliminate 54% of marijuana use. I mean, this is pretty profound stuff. I mean, there isn't a whole lot of things we could do in science or medicine that can reduce risk in that great of a manner. So if you're working to prevent heart disease, for instance, or cancer, or end homelessness, or even improve business profitability, you can align your work and to incorporate the common goal of preventing ACEs and moderating the effects. It will reduce not only the impacts in your area of interest or your passion, but in all the others as well. So this collective ability to impact the well-being of multiple areas, regardless of your focus of interest, I think it's just really exciting. Next slide. Here's another slide that I threw in there just to kind of focus a little bit on painkillers and alcoholism, this idea that drinking problems, these can all be significantly impacted if we focus on reducing ACE scores. Next slide. So our culture's built separate systems, as I mentioned, to ways of thinking about health and social problems. And this way of doing business in society is, we know, called a siloed approach. And each silo has its own budget, its own training, its own mental modeling and prevention strategies. So the ACEs study and its related neuroscience findings shows us that reviewing health and social problems as separate issues is really an illusion. It's an illusion based on outdated mental models. And so now we know that many health and social problems have common causes, the powerful impact of ACEs throughout the life course. So we used to talk about breaking down silos, but you know, that's really not practical necessarily in our organized siloed system of healthcare. But the good news is none of us have to stop working on the issues we care about. We simply add this thread of understanding ACEs to our life's work. And that impact extends beyond just what we're doing. Next slide. So now we're going to switch to, I think, just kind of wrapping this up. We don't have to necessarily talk about all the negative parts, but to leave you with focus of hope, because ACEs are not destiny. Next slide. There are core protective factors that we know improve resiliency. There's capabilities, attachments and belonging, and community culture, spirituality. So this positive view of yourself and your capabilities and what happens to you can really build a strong structure of resiliency. Let's go to look at a few of these a little bit more in detail before we wrap up. Next slide, please. So capabilities, individual capabilities include how we think of ourselves, how to self-regulate, how to feel self-efficacy and build that into yourself. These are building better pathways in your brain, habits, if you will, that can overcome the structural issues that are there from childhood trauma. I often say individual capabilities are the kinds of things you work on with self-help groups, with counseling, and with many other factors that are available to us, particularly in our mental health service world. Next slide. But the next one is relationships and belonging. And this is a community-based issue that also has a profound impact on resiliency. I often go back to the conversations I've had with individuals who've really thrived in their life despite having profoundly high adverse childhood experiences. And they're thriving. You look like what happened to you. I'd be surprised how many of them had individuals in their lives that were constantly there for them. They loved them unconditionally. They had a grandma that lived next door that they could stop by after work or after school that would support them. And these kinds of relationships of caring and competent people are vital contributors to resiliency. These are things that you can develop even without having personal relationships. These are just things that you can develop in a community structure just from a sense of a skilled, reliable individual who knows how to respond well. Next slide. And then, of course, vibrant communities. And this is important because communities are important to come up with things, the structures that are valuable to them. You have to have sensitivity to culture. You have to have a sensitivity to history. And more importantly, you can't walk into a community and tell them what to do. We have to nurture leadership from within the community themselves, because that's where the solutions and the answers come from. Next slide. So this community capacity development is just a model that talks about leadership expansion from within the community itself, bringing them together with tools and structures so that they can learn how to develop, sharing that learning, and then looking at the outcomes and just kind of that iterative process of doing this over and over again. And this works in a lot of models. Next slide. I want to just share with you one more thing, help that matters. Next slide, about these feelings of feeling support and the important impact this can have on outcomes, health outcomes. Next slide. For instance, in a situation where people had ACEs scores and they had reported low support and hope. And then next slide. It shows what their support and hope scales look like after just having a little bit of support in the neighborhood community. Next slide. ACEs and mental health symptoms. Again, as ACE scores go up, mental health symptoms go up as well. Next slide. But then when you add more help into a community, go back please, more help to a community, you'll find a significant reduction in self-reported mental health symptoms. And often this is just something as simple as having one person, 1 to 2 people that you can call in times of stress, somebody to pick up your kid from school, etc. So there are simple ways of community development that can have profound impacts, not only on ACE scores themselves, but on the outcomes of ACE scores. Next slide. So community resilience, community reciprocity, watching out for people, social bridging, caring for other people, even if they're outside of your immediate social circle. These are all things that probably have a much deeper impact than what we traditionally think about. So better rates of obesity, better rates of mental health symptoms, and particularly since we're talking today about substance use disorders, I suspect these will have profound impacts on substance use disorder, especially in recovery. So we often think just of the individual and what the individual needs, but these social resiliency factors, I believe, are also an important component of bridging that gap. Next slide. So the change is up to us. I hope you found this information helpful, useful. I have found it to be a dramatic tool, not only in direct medical care, but certainly in the public health world. And it has shaped my thoughts about the way I think about individuals and also social communities. Next slide. Thank you very much for your attention. I failed to put my slide in there, but if you're interested in having further conversations, you can reach me. Put your email in the chat box, and I'll be happy to reach out.
Thanks so much, Dr. Mercantante, for taking the time to be with us today, and to all of you who attended our session. Today's presentation is one of many webinars scheduled throughout the month of September for Recovery Month. You can still register for any upcoming presentations on our website at sccmh.org. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will pop up. Please fill this out, especially if you are requesting continuing education credits. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next time.